Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy. My guest today is Chris Marquis. Christopher Marquis is the Sinyi professor at the University of Cambridge Judge School of Business. He writes a regular column for Forbes, and his work has appeared in the Boston Globe, Washington Post, Fortune, Time, Foreign Policy, and Harvard Business Review. His previous books, Better Business, How the B Corp is Remaking Capitalism, and Mao and Markets. The Mao and Markets was a Financial Times Best Book of 2022 and were published by Yale University Press. Chris, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks so much, Ryan. Great to be with you.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming. And maybe for folks who don't know who you are, can you tell us a bit about your background and how you first got interested in the work you're doing today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a professor at a business school. What I've been studying and researching and teaching on for the past, I guess it's almost 20 years now, is back in the day, it was corporate social responsibility, has really developed into social entrepreneurship, sustainable business, regenerative business more recently. So I was teaching on this, as early as 2005 and got involved actually in how we got to know each one another through our work on B Corps. I started studying B Corps in 2009. Actually, a student had told me about this movement. We were studying these large companies. I was teaching about these large companies doing CSR programs. And the student said, what we should really be looking at are companies that have social mission at their core, that have a business model that is designed to create social and environmental impact, not just some side thing like a philanthropy program. So that was really very impactful to me. It sort of started me on this long journey of the book you mentioned, Better Business, and then also, a lot of the interviews I've been doing for this new book I have coming out, which is called The Profiteers.
Yeah. And the Profiteers, and can you give folks a sense of what was the B Corp book about, and maybe how is this new book sort of a little bit different take on some of the same ideas?
Sure. Very good question, because they are really deeply connected, although some people think like, okay, one called Better Business, one called The Profiteers. It sounds very, very different, but they really have very common themes. Both are about the fact that business is perhaps the most powerful engine for social and environmental good in our world. But there are tremendous barriers to actually enacting that. There's a lot of amazing companies like Lift Economy, like a lot of B Corps, like a lot of companies actually that aren't B Corps, that are actually have sort of founders and companies that have a mission to really do well in the world. But the way the economic system, markets, even societal norms are constructed, it really places sort of the shareholders of the company or investors in a primary position. This is even the way, people think. And so, Better Business, I focused on the B Corp movement. And the reason why I did that is that not because I thought every company should be a B Corp, although if that were the case, maybe we would have, the world would be a lot better. But I understand, it's a very rigorous certification. And I think it has to be rigorous to mean something. However, why I use the term movement in there is because actually the influence of the broader B Corp ecosystem around changing accountability and transparency standards through the B Impact Assessment, which a lot of companies and investors use, changing corporate governance, the benefit corporate form that now exists all over the US and many countries in Europe, many countries in Latin America, even Rwanda in Africa now has benefit corporations.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So this is something that's spreading around the world. I think there's lots of interest around investors, impact investors, but then also, other large investors that are really seeing the power of actually trying to harness companies that have social mission at their core because, they can actually, deliver better returns. I think it's a slippery slope to always be sort of saying there's this win-win and companies really have to be socially responsible because they'll deliver financial results. I think there are cases where that's true, but I don't think that's necessarily a motivation that we should always be sort of articulating, because it can be a slippery slope. And in the Profiteers, that's actually one of the things I try to get at is how there's the depth of the sort of economic and social system where companies are really encouraged to externalize their costs. So this concept externalities, where social and environmental costs of companies' production, they don't have to pay for, but society and the general public pay for them. So the most famous one or most well-known one is carbon emissions. So for the most part, even though there's now new sort of carbon tax and sort of carbon markets that are coming online, companies don't have to pay for the pollution that they sort of emit. This creates all kinds of problems in the world, locally, around sort of community damage, health issues, climate change, global issue. And so these impacts are widespread. You have obviously emissions, you have waste, you have an agriculture systems, huge damage to biodiversity, inequality, discrimination. All of these issues, companies want to sort of hide the fact that a lot of their profits are built on these unequal and unsustainable systems. And so in the Profiteers, I try to actually expose and unpack that in a more systematic way, and then also highlight the pioneering companies that are saying these systems are unfair. We're going to actually internalize those externalities. So those are sort of the two books and how they contrast.
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned this idea of the win-win or do good, do well. And it's interesting, right? Because I feel like that was the pitch for many years in the socially responsible business space was, hey, just do this because it makes you money. And I think your work and also Marjorie Kelly with her Wealth Supremacy book talking about why does it always have to be do good because it makes you money? Like it's still about the money at the end of the day. Could you say more about that, like sort of tension?
Sure, definitely. So there's a couple issues with that. So one is that I think in many cases that is a lie. I mean, that companies are trying to put on, sort of basically pull the wool over people's eyes and think, make the public or governments think like, oh, well, actually, if it is in companies' best interests, then we don't have to regulate them. Then we don't have to sort of hold their feet to the fire for social and environmental standards. So I think you look at the Business Roundtable. I mean, this is the perfect example. In 2019, they put out, this is this group of 200 largest company CEOs in the US. They put out this statement of purpose of the corporation saying, companies exist to serve stakeholders like employees, consumers, et cetera. Well, sounds great. Everyone was very excited about this. I mean, I even was pretty excited about it. I thought even though maybe I didn't believe that they would do it, at least it would bring these issues of stakeholders to broader public attention. But if you look at actually, part of the problem actually with saying things is that over time, people can check if you actually do it. And so it turns out these Business Roundtable companies have more environmental infractions than non-Business Roundtable companies, greater environmental damage and carbon emissions. They treat workers worse. They deliver more money actually back to their shareholders. There's been a bunch of academic studies that have documented this. It's so interesting to me that I would think that maybe they would like be the same. Maybe they wouldn't, but they actually do worse. And one of the studies that I read, I think it's a really interesting idea. It's hard to know why they do worse. The author theorized it as moral licensing. So, the idea of moral licensing is like if you do something good, you feel sort of licensed to do something bad. So, I do yoga in the morning. I feel like, oh, I can have that donut after lunch. So the fact that these companies are doing worse really, I think, draws questions to this win-win idea. And so one, I think it's not the right discourse because so many companies are using it, in a really bad way. And this is one of the reasons I wrote this Profiteers book. And I have this whole chapter on corporate gaslighting, how companies are really aiming to trick us, basically, so we don't understand that the roots of their profits actually are in damage to the public sphere. So that's one reason why. The second reason why this win-win is not appropriate. The second reason why is that the evidence on this is not clear. So there's been a bunch of studies that have shown companies doing ESG end up, performing better or doing a variety of different, be it various employee benefits or environmental works, end up doing better. But Actually, a number of those studies have come under significant criticism, and scholars are unable to replicate them. And now there's a lot of thinking that maybe a lot of these studies were a result of sort of wishful thinking or hopeful thinking on the side of the academics. And so
these are studies that are saying if you do good, you'll make more money. That's kind of the...
That's correct. Some of the most well-cited studies that are frequently, cited like in congressional testimony and Larry Fink are actually have shown to be not true, basically. So this is another reason why. And the final reason why, which is really, really important, which also resonates very much with Marjorie Kelly's book, is that the issue is that we are living in a paradigm of shareholder primacy, wealth supremacy. And the issue is that if we are going to say win-win, we're just reinforcing that system and paradigm. And people might think like, wow, how can you actually change the underlying set of assumptions in our economy? Well, this happens all the time, actually. It may seem like it's tough, but before 1970s or so, actually, companies were not so monomaniacally focused on their shareholders. You see all kinds of social changes in regards to LGBT sort of marriage and acceptance and the variety of other sort of issues where back 20, 30 years ago, would be sort of socially acceptable to sort of, which is now sort of seen as tremendously discriminative as it should be. But norms have changed around these issues. And so I think that we should not be thinking that it's too hard to change the system. I think we should be focusing on changing the system. And it's one reason I wrote the book with the more provocative title than Better Business and really dig into the problems with the system, because I think that's where we need to be focusing. We don't need the 1,001th or 10,001th study on doing well by doing good. We need to actually think about exposing and reconstructing the system.
It's definitely your populist book, right? It goes straight to the... So tell me about this. So you wrote The Better Business, and that book's a lot about like, let's highlight these companies. They have cool practices, B Corps. And then when did you start to say, actually, this, like, I'm not seeing what I think should be said, and like talk about that transition into like writing the book?
Sure. So a couple of things. So one, some of the elements of this argument actually are a little bit in Better Business around these externalities. And I do think, so some of the critique is consistent, but sort of two things. So one, I'll say this is the second thing first. The second thing is that actually a lot of it came through my inspiration by talking to a lot of businesses that saw this issue much better than I did. So for instance, one example that was very influential to me is a company, B Corp in the Bay Area, like yourself, Grove Collaborative. The founder, current chair, Stu Landsberg, he told me about how for his company, which is a company that sort of makes and sells and distributes health and beauty and home care products. You think about those, like sort of soaps or cleaning sprays or whatever, traditionally those are packaged in bottles with a lot of plastic. And he said to me, where I'm like laser focused is on plastic, because plastic is the biggest externality in my business. And I never thought about plastic actually as an externality. I thought of it as a horrible pollutant and a bad thing, in our oceans. And I'm not like I'm a fan of plastic, but I never fully really made the connection. This was an externality. And the reason why it's an externality, as Stu explained to me, and I've, have come to really understand better, is that it is so much cheaper for companies to make things out of virgin plastic. It's actually more expensive to make things out of recycled plastic, or actually to try to reformulate your products in an effective way so consumers like them, so you can avoid plastic. So it's just easier to sort of kick the can down the road, so to speak, and just keep making things with virgin plastic. This is what all kinds of companies do. Like you look at in packaging, like Coke and Pepsi, they are two of the most plastic using and wasting companies in the world. There's been these censuses of plastic. Thousands of people around the world spend weeks and months gathering up plastic, and then they see where the plastic trash in our world is from, and it's from Coke and Pepsi are at the top of it. But what do Coke and Pepsi do? They advertise the fact that they're trying to create all new like recycling systems. And, there's this ad that they have where it's like young person from Pepsi, Coke, and also Dr. Pepper in their, like their respective hats and say, we're working together on recycling. And that's total bullshit. I hope we can say bullshit on your show, because less than 10% of plastic is recycled. Companies know this. They're tricking us basically to think that it shouldn't be their responsibility, that it should actually be consumers' responsibility, because they know if we actually realize that it should be their responsibility, it's going to be much more expensive for them. So this, my thinking really came about from talking to people that are deep in this and thoughtful in this, like Stu, another Bay Area company, Allbirds, really very thoughtful in actually accounting for its net zero, or I should say net zero, so its sort of decarbonization plans, sort of looking at its entire production stack and how to get sort of have regenerative agriculture for their wool and ship things in different ways. And this is another area where I think there's a lot of tricking of consumers going on in the general public around net zero, because virtually none of the companies that claim net zero have any sort of plan. It's always out to like 2050, so it's going to be some other person's problem. There's no sort of intermediate steps or plans to get there. They just think like, oh, we're going to say we're net zero 2050, and no one will actually look. And so far, no one has really looked. So they're sort of lucky. But anyway, so that's where a lot of these sort of thoughts and ideas came from. It's from the people that are doing good, and then I sort of reconstructed the critique from that.
And do you think if we were to talk to Jay or Bart and Andrew from B Lab, they might say, well, these companies aren't, like, they're not bad. Like, these corporations aren't inherently evil. They just have this profit maximization, shareholder primacy piece. So if we can get rid of that, then there is more of an incentive to address plastic or like be less gaslighty. But do you see that as holding water, that argument?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that this sort of logic of our system around shareholder primacy is a big deal. But I think they are evil. I mean, in some ways, and it relates back even to my students that really attuned me back in 2009. And I didn't even realize this until very recently, that we should be looking at companies' business models. We shouldn't be looking at the sort of occasional good things they do under the sort of banner of shareholder primacy. To keep beating on Coke and Pepsi, there was just some reports that came out on them, and I think there's some sort of slave labor in their supply chain that they actually know about. Pepsi in particular owns Frito-Lay, and they engineer foods to actually make them addictive, which is a huge cause of the sort of health and obesity problems we have. Their business is basically like trucking around heavy water-filled, sugar beverages. So there is nothing, in my opinion, redeemable about the core business model of many companies. And I think we need to go beyond just saying, let's change the logic of shareholder primacy. I think we need to really fundamentally hold companies to account for their business models. So this is, in one case, what I'm acting.
Yeah. So when you're saying business models, like, what are their core business? Not like, do they have a lighting retrofit, or they have a volunteer day and stuff like that?
Yeah. Or even say, okay, we care about, our stakeholders, and we're doing these great things for our employees, which I certainly want companies to be doing great things for their employees, or doing some environmental issues. Like, for instance, you look at companies like Google, for instance, they have been proactive, from what I understand, in having a lot of sort of solar in their data centers, which use a lot, or basically have done, from what I understand, a good job in some environmental programs. Someone could correct that if I'm wrong, but it doesn't matter. My point, even if they're great in that, the point is they own YouTube, and YouTube is so, with the algorithms and creating problems with disinformation, misinformation, and the politicization and siloing in our society. This is a huge social problem that is at the core of Google and YouTube's business model. I mean, this is something that, they can't redeem, in my opinion, by being net zero, if they actually are net zero.
Yeah. So what are some of the folks that you highlight on the sort of, regenerative, and, I guess I'd even love your thoughts on is regenerative becoming a buzzword that like Walmart's regenerative all of a sudden, or like, it's like, how do you see that?
Yeah, I think that this is something we have to watch out for because I think, Pepsi is saying that they're doing these various things regeneratively, and maybe some of their practices are. So I do think there's potential with the idea of regenerative as into sort of reshape a new model of thinking, because as I discuss in the book, so all these practices and business models I'm talking about are things that are creating negative externalities. So Pepsi and it's labor and supply chains, it's issues with sort of obesity and health, it's issues with plastic. These are like issues with the core of the business model that create negative externalities. So the idea of regeneration, as I discuss it, it's about the company's business model creating positive externalities. So this is, thinking about how the business model of the company can actually sort of give back and restore. And so an example that I give in the book, and it's, I hate to always be drawing on, these well-hewn examples, but Patagonia. And then,
you can't use Patagonia, actually. No, I'm just kidding.
I'm going to use Patagonia. So I mean, it's sad, but really, and I'll use it because I think the story of it, as Vincent Stanley, who is really active in communicating about the mission, how the mission of Patagonia has really guided the company, told me that they, for a long time, the mission of Patagonia, the sort of espoused sort of stated mission, had the phrase, "When do as little harm as possible," something like that. And when they got into Patagonia Provisions in 2012, they started learning about regenerative agriculture, which are, sort of agricultural practices that restore the soil and, restore the landscapes and give back in ways that actually create more positives than actually draw down like traditional agriculture. He said this actually created like an aha moment within the company that, we should actually be focusing our whole business on this idea of giving back and being regenerative. And so, as you know, Patagonia changed its mission to, we're in business to save our home planet. They all kinds of things around even discouraging consumption, repair, returns, secondhand. So, they really thought like, how can we reframe our business in a way that it's not about sort of doing as little harm as possible, but thinking about how we can actually give back. And I think that this is something that a lot of companies are wrestling with. I mean, a lot of companies that, in the B Corp movement. And so I think that it has a lot of potential to be greenwashed and for companies to use it and it become meaningless. But I do think that at its core, if companies are thinking like, okay, how with my business model or with my core products and services, can I do better for the world, leave the world better off than if I wasn't there? I think there's a lot of potential.
Yeah, it's I think it's challenging even for the companies that want to do that. Like Patagonia probably still gets 95% of its revenue or more from clothing, right? But I think what you're pointing to is sort of this bigger sort of shift in how we think about business as to not just have how can we minimize the harm we're doing, but how are we actually, maybe it's a longer term timeline, but let's actually change the entire business, which is scary. And but it's also, I think, what our planet needs, really.
Yeah, I think exactly. I mean, I think that we're at a breaking point in many of these systems, and things, like biodiversity that people don't pay as much attention to are also sort of a ticking time bomb, and in addition to climate and inequality issues. And so we're at the point where we need some drastic action.
Are there any other examples, maybe like of companies that particularly stood out to you in the book as regenerative and really leading on that edge?
So a lot of what I do is look particularly at some of the different externalities and then how companies are creating business models to overcome those. I mean, it might not be like a fully regenerative company yet, but so again, to use another sort of, and a lot of what I'm trying to do in the book, and similar to Marjorie Kelly, is to try to highlight, the idea that there are other ways to do things, and it is only our mindsets in some ways that are holding us back. And one of my favorite examples there, because it's still really bothers people because it's so counterintuitive is the companies like Grace and Bakery that are doing things like open hiring, or Dave's Killer Bread doing second chance hiring, or Rhino Foods with some of their work with the employees. And these are practices that so fly in the face of traditional standard human resources. Human resources, mind you, that have all kinds, human resources in the United States at least are designed for like white guys like you and I, all kinds of bias in hiring process, how things are, how things end up occurring in this open hiring, where we're just going to basically hire people in the order that they come in to overcome that. So that's something where I spend a reasonable amount of time talking about the importance of practices like that, because it's both because that practice itself, I think, is important and what it's overcoming, but also that there's probably a lot of other innovations out there that have not been sort of fully articulated or widely shared. But, we need to remember that we've constructed this world ourselves, and it's constructed in a way that is fundamentally unfair to the majority of people, and we need to be thinking creatively about ways to deconstruct it and build models that are fair for people.
Do you see, this is maybe more of a philosophical question, but capitalism itself, is it possible? I've thought about this over the years. In the B Corp world, we talk about using business as a force for good and stakeholder capitalism, but it's still capitalism, right? It's still the privatization of private ownership over the production of goods and services, and sort of taking the profit from that. And so I'm curious if you see, is it possible to do what you're talking about in creating a regenerative economy with the model of capitalism, or what's your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, good question. I can't say that I fully have it. Like,
You haven't figured it out yet.
I should have figured out. But I have consciously not used capitalism in this new book because of this sort of mindset issue. I think if we keep framing things as capitalism or socialism, these terms in some ways are a little meaningless, because actually, it's very hybrid and mixed types of economies that we have. And many times these terms, both capitalism, socialism, get thrown around in pejorative ways to say negative things. And so, I do think that, there's enough examples that I've seen of companies that are really, I think, authentically working to create good in the world, that it's possible, but we need to re-engineer the mindsets to expect, to have a company like Coke or Pepsi. Just unacceptable to have at the core of your business, exploiting society and the environment. So, and that's a long project and process, but I do think it's possible.
Yeah. And what else excited you in writing it, or did you learn certain things that you think listeners would like to know about? What else do you want folks to know about the book?
Yeah, good question. The book in of itself, it was like an amazing learning journey. So it really came about. So after I published Better Business, I started doing a set of Forbes articles on, in many ways, this was, to sort of pull nuggets that I didn't have, wasn't able, sort of stories that I wasn't able to actually fit in the book, give them sort of voice and a platform. And then, I just really got into it and loved that, sort of researching companies that way and writing those up. And so, I've done well over 200 of these now. I'm not doing it as actively as I used to, but, there's hundreds of companies' stories that are in the book. I think that one of the companies that I've been very impressed with recently is Natura & Co., the Brazilian cosmetics company. And one of the reasons why is that they, I think, really get this idea about understanding the impacts of their business model, and have really dug into this sort of integrated profit and loss statement, where they actually measure the sort of natural capital positives and negatives. And it seems, as far as I can tell, are very sort of honest and authentic on the negative side, social and human capital. So all kinds of things around the consultants that they hire to sell their products. So they do, the way they sell is through like an Avon type of model. And they own Avon actually, where it's independent consultants that are sort of out there selling. And I think they really try to assess that and are honest that actually a lot of those people are not making living wages, and they have sort of trying to put their eye on the ball to understand how to do that. And then obviously financial capital, sort of the traditional thing that companies do. So that's something where I, more recently, I do talk about them in the book a bit, but as I think about the next set of work that I'm going to do, and I won't be writing a book again in the next couple of years, but I'm thinking about how I can try to get at this issue of really understanding and assessing the business models of companies and how we can hold companies account for their business model. Because I think the whole idea of stakeholder capitalism is premised around understanding side things, to be honest. It's like what good companies are doing in the environment, but that's aside from actually a lot of their core business or what they're doing for employees. So I think that is like really where I'm focusing, and Natura is one company that comes to mind.
Yeah, I like that approach. And is there anything you're particularly excited about? And, maybe do you want to mention like some of the tours you're going on and some of the upcoming stuff?
I'm glad you mentioned that specifically, because this is something I am totally excited about. So Better Business, I launched it in the middle of COVID in September 2020. Did a lot of talks, but a lot of them were via Zoom. And, I've developed so many, I feel right, friendships with people that I've gotten to know, mostly virtually. Occasionally I've seen people at like the Champions Retreat or some other venue. So I'm going to do a pretty extensive tour for this book, very much supported by a lot of B Corps and other companies and conscious capitalism and other sort of, relatively aligned organizations. So the book launches on May 14th. I'm going to be in Southern California that week. I have a number of events starting in San Diego and then Orange County and then LA and then Santa Barbara. I'm going to be in Northern California, not the following week, but the week after that. I have a number of events set up there with some local NGOs and some B Corps and some accelerators. I'm also going to be spending some time in Chicago and DC. So I have a number of events set up in both those locations. Probably later in the year, we'll be going to Miami and to Atlanta, and then also to the Northeast, probably Boston. So I hope to make it up to Vermont, because there's a lot of great stuff going on in Vermont. And the first interviews I did actually for Better Business was a road trip I took to Vermont and talked to the Ben and Jerry's and Rhino Foods and a variety of the other folks there. So I hope to make it back up there too. So I'm really excited to actually be out talking to people, meeting people in person that I haven't actually met in person, but I've talked to via Zoom, and I'm sure make a lot of other great connections too.
Yeah. And are there things from the book that you would encourage people to do? Like, is there like a message of like, here's what I think should happen as a result of some of this research and work you've been doing?
Yeah. I mean, I think that after all my criticism might sound kind of a little bit lame a bit, but I think that the idea that consumers are going to save us is wishful thinking. I hope that consumers can make good decisions and buy sustainable and equitably produced products. But I think that working in the politics is something that, and getting strong legislation and the political leaders that believe that we need to change the system is the most important thing. And this is something where, one of the things that has been very influential in my thinking is actually relocating to the UK and spending more time in Europe, where I think that there is a lot more sort of general society progressive thought around what businesses should do as far as for the public good and for the environment. And the EU in particular has, in the last year or two, had a number of pretty significant pieces of legislation and regulations come into place around companies' accountability. There's this law CSRD, which is going to really transform corporate reporting on ESG, social and environmental issues. It's going to affect companies in the US, going to affect companies in China, that if they're ever going to do any business in the EU. So I think that's a big deal. California actually has something similar, although it's going to be coming in a little bit later. There's green claims laws, anti-deforestation laws. The green claims is really interesting, and there's been a number of companies that have been held to account for their greenwashing behavior recently. So, companies, if they're going to actually make green claims, if they can't back it up, they'll be sued. So there's a lot, I think, on the policy front. I think where a lot of the shareholder primacy got its roots in society was through a number of legal changes. And although I really am articulating a lot of solutions from business, I think to change the system, policy is really, really important. And I do think many of these EU changes, they may be ushering in a new era, like many of the in 1970s, 1980s American policies that actually had a big influence on the global economic system. So anyways, so that's support your politicians, be active is one thing I'll say.
I love it. Speaking of politics, I was wanting to ask you this earlier, but I will now, is around how do you see the anti-ESG sort of like recent phenomenon intersecting with some of your work? And like, how do you see those two things happening?
Yeah, it's really frustrating and disappointing because, and I talk about this in the book, I mean, this is a prime example of this sort of corporate gaslighting or interested parties trying to distract it for their own self-interest. So there's around a lot of these anti-ESG laws, or sort of shielding investors that may have ESG. I mean, it's funded by the Heritage Foundation, the Koch brothers. So these are organizations that they're fossil fuel oriented companies. They have a huge interest in this, and they are able to write up these various policies and briefs that get distributed to these states, that it's very easy for the legislators or the governors or whomever there to be using these. And then, it's like one or two steps away from these fossil fuel interests, and they are able to drape it in this sort of anti-woke, anti-American type of discourse. But it's very much driven by sort of people very selfishly.
It still profits, it sounds like, at the end of the day.
Exactly. And so the SEC, recently, disappointingly, did not include Scope 3, extensive Scope 3 emissions reporting in it's a regulation, I guess, that they put forth. But I see all this contention in the US, but actually this CSRD law in the EU, the way that they constructed it, actually it's going to, in some ways, trump not in the person, but in the verb, many of these issues. Because as it continues to roll out, it'll cover any company, the entire corporate-wide information of any company that wants to do business in the EU. So Nike has some EU subsidiary, sells a lot of shoes, etc. So it won't just be the Nike EU subsidiary, but Nike will be on the hook for its entire global reporting. And so you're around pretty, like all kinds of human rights and supply chains, very detailed Scope 3 reporting through, on the environment side. It'll have sort of bite. So actually the directors and executives of companies will be legally liable if there's false information presented. So I think that obviously we've been in a little bit of period of deglobalization, but companies are still very globally connected, and that a lot of these EU policies will actually counteract some of the American sort of craziness around anti-ESG.
That's great to hear. I'm wondering if you could also speak to what do you need right now, and how can the listeners help you grow this next economy?
Yeah, good question. Hopefully they can tell I'm sort of passionate and excited about this. So please be in touch. Invite me to come talk at your place. I mean, it's something I would love it if you'd buy some books if I were to go talk to you. But as many people, if they listen, probably if you invite me, I would love to come and listen and learn about your company. And, it's sort of a two-way information exchange. And so can feed into my future research. I'm a faculty member at a major university. I'm paid for the research I do in some way. So I don't have to necessarily, I'm not always out there trying to sort of sell books, but I'm trying to get out and communicate about what I think I'm very passionate about, and also sort of learn from companies. So please be in touch and invite me to give a talk at your place.
Love it. And where can folks reach you or learn more about your work?
Sure. So probably Googling is the easiest. I mean, I do have a website, chrismarquis.com. So you can go there to learn about my work. If you want to be in touch with me on the Cambridge University's website, my email's listed. You should feel free to be directly in touch.
Okay, awesome. Well, Chris, thanks so much for coming on the show. I love that you have this sort of the B Corp book about the movement, but this is taking some of those ideas and talking more about regenerative and this idea of the gaslighting, corporate gaslighting, I think really important as well among a lot of the issues that you raise in the book. So thanks so much for continue to do the work, and hopefully we get you back on the show in the future.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. Great to finally get a chance to be on the show, Ryan. I'm a big fan.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.